Now I think it's time to make a start. He'll be sharing the screen with his slides, so it's over to you, Wojciech.
Hello everybody, can you hear me well?
Yes.
And can you see my slides? Let me just press play. Do you see the title slide? Sorry,
yes.
Checking the technicalities. So once again, thank you very much for having me. Good evening to all of you. It's very nice to be part of the group for this evening. I'm very happy to share some reflections and conclusions of several years now of my research into what I call fair free public transport. So others in your group have already told me about indeed the role of fair free public transport in your charter related to climate change. I'll try to refer to that and the environmental impact of fair free public transport a little bit. I think the purpose of this presentation is indeed to give you an overview of what fair free public transport is, where it exists, and perhaps how we can analyze it or how we can understand it. What kind of questions are important to ask when when reflecting on whether this should be implemented in your locality, for example, in Birmingham or West Midlands in general. It's not a litany of let's say, it's not a praise of the policy itself. I'm not an activist. I'm not here to say whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I think my role is to basically, to show you what kind of different ways there are of in which the idea of abolishing fares and providing unconditional access to a good such as public transport can be done. So it seems to be a very simple idea, but in fact, the way that this is done in different localities around the world, because it's a policy developed in many, many different countries by now, it really depends from case to case. Okay, without further ado, let me try to make this work. Great. If at any point, I don't know, there's any audio or video issues, just please shout. I'm not paying attention to the chat because it's just impossible between the two screens, and I prefer to see some of your faces at least over the chat. But so if something doesn't work, just let me know by interrupting me. And I'm very happy to take your questions afterwards. I really look forward to those. So, fair free public transport. Well, if we just tune into the main debates and scholarly discussions about transport and how to plan it and how to manage it, it's not difficult to find opinions or even studies that basically say that this policy, it's something that should not be. It's something nonsensical. One of key experts in Europe, based in Switzerland, Vincent Kaufmann, even wrote or said that this is a policy that makes no sense. At the same time, it's a policy that clearly is on the agenda among not only over 150 local authorities around the world, but also a plethora of local movements, citizen associations such as yourselves. So there's a bit of a controversy and a contradiction there. So it's a policy that is certainly gaining momentum, but it's still very controversial and something that is definitely not on the mainstream agenda of how to run transport, how to run transport provision, and how to plan it. Very quickly, what do I mean when I say fair free public transport? Well, the key element is the lack of fares. So it's a system that basically provides unconditional access to the great majority of its users. There can be some exceptions on a great majority of routes. Again, some exceptions may apply, but most of the routes, most of the services running in this network are for free, and most of the time. So there can be perhaps some exceptional times, I don't know, night services or on some specific days of the year or whatnot. But most of the time, great majority of users and pretty much everywhere have access to public transport. Public is another keyword. So I'm not talking about, again, a flurry of privatized or private services and supermarket buses, minivans transporting workers to factories and whatnot, operated by essentially private entities. So this is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in essentially a system or a situation in which there is a 100% public subsidy to a publicly operated transport network. Of course, the vehicles themselves and the drivers might be hired by some private operator, private company, that does not matter, but it's all under some kind of umbrella of a public authority that commits to such a subsidy that the tickets, income from tickets, income from fares is not essential for the service to run and provide quality service. This is important because, well, here I'm talking about full fare-free public transport. So exactly the situations in which such provision of free access most of the time for most of the users exists, as opposed to a variety of partial situations. And I'm sure that maybe you've even experienced as a passenger some special situations. I don't know, buses that are free to use on Sundays, or after a specific event, a natural disaster or some political crisis, or car-free days, or tickets being provided for specific groups, types of passengers. I don't know, the elderly people, students, people suffering from some physical handicap, whatnot. So there is, of course, plenty of situations, I'm sure in the UK, but also in other cities around Europe, in which some of these partial fare-free public transport systems exist. So here I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in networks which guarantee or provide this access to the, again, great majority of users most of the time, and on a great majority of routes available. Well, another basic question, but I think an important one and maybe an interesting one. When did it all start? Well, as far as we know, I might be wrong here, and this is what I've found out about, but I'm very happy to be challenged and told about cases that exist before the 1970. Well, it all started in the suburbs of LA. So that's the first locality that we know of that actually implemented a system that was fare free. And let's say until the 1990s or 2000, it was not really a policy that had a lot of steam. I mean, it was a bunch of localities in Europe and some in North America, in the US, 2 places in Brazil. As you can see, towards 2010 and 2017, we see a sharp rise. I don't have robust data for 2020 or even 2021. This is something that, together with other colleagues, we are focusing on right now to do some kind of update to these numbers. But it's safe to say that right now there is at least 150 localities, if not more, that are providing fare-free public transport, full fare-free public transport. So we see that there is a sharp increase in the last, say, 10, 15 years. It's a policy that's gaining some kind of popularity, some kind of attention, even though obviously this is still, it's a minority. I mean, it's not, we can't say that this is something that a big share of public transport systems are doing. It's still a small group, albeit this group is clearly growing. What kind of cities are doing this? So where can you find fare-free public transport? So here we see a typology of these 99 localities that we could identify in 2019, depending on the size. So we see that at least 2/3 localities that have less than 50,000 inhabitants. So small or very small towns, even some semi-urban, semi-rural communities. There is a bit more in the 50 to 99,000 group, and 9 cities that had from 100 to 249,000 inhabitants. Only 2, you could argue, that have more than 250,000 inhabitants. So these would be, well, first of all, the most important case being Tallinn, so the capital of Estonia, which has almost 500,000 inhabitants, which leads many critics to say that, well, it's a policy for small places only and something that, cannot be applied in big areas. But then when we actually add to this all other cases that existed throughout history and now don't exist anymore for many different reasons, but primarily for political reasons. So the lack of political will leading these localities to reinstall fares. We see that actually the number of cities that are quite big that did FFPT is much larger. So there we see all these cities at the bottom of the slide in New Jersey, Spain, Texas, Bologna in Italy, Denver in Colorado, and one big city in Ukraine, and another one in Italy, Rome. Did it back in the 70s for a few years. So it's not necessarily a policy for small cities only. Well, I will not get into that unless, of course, you have some questions. There's a specific geography to this policy. So we see some clusters. It's particularly popular in Brazil, France, Poland, and maybe surprisingly US. And well, I'll be drawing in the next couple of minutes from three cases that I've mostly focused on. So Orbaniu in France, Tallinn, that I already mentioned in Estonia, and a small town in the southern part of Poland, Żory, to again mention this diversity of ways in which free public transport has been applied and questions that are usually raised with regard to this policy. So here are these two main cities. Let's skip that. Well, I will leave these slides with you. I will not dive into all these details, but I think it's nice to cover it properly. Although I will not probably, discuss all the slides that I have brought today with me. I'm also interested in your questions, right? But it's very common for transport experts and transport planners to raise questions about FFPT, to criticize us against this supposedly uneconomical and irrational impact. So there is this idea that fares are basically what separates users from rational and irrational behavior. So the moment that we remove fares, public transport passengers simply go crazy. They start using public transport, inverted commas, of course. They start using transport not for any particular purpose, but to basically use public transport for the sake of using it. So there's some useless mobility appearing, overcrowding, which on top of that supposedly leads to significantly decreased network revenue, since of course there's no tickets, so there's no revenue from tickets. However, and that's the question raised by, I would say, majority of people who have written about FFPT by now. However, the actual evidence shows that there is very little vandalism or this irrational behavior that would be even leading to some kind of signals of insecurity that has been observed so far in all these cases of FFPT. There is very little evidence of any kind of network capacity and reliability issues. So in very few cases has there really been issues with overcrowding, with just too many people trying to use buses or trams or whatever is being made available in these public transport networks. What's however very clear is that in all cases, and that's I think pretty obvious, without any exceptions that would be noted so far, abolishing fares leads to a significant increase of public transport usage. So there is definitely more passengers and more people on board of public transport. Without going yet into the question of what were these people using before for transport and what kind of people are using public transport as a result. And paradoxically, in some cases, again, we don't have time to dive into these numbers until or unless you have some specific questions. Paradoxically, in some localities, abolishing fares actually creates additional revenue, and that relates to very particular local context. But surprisingly, well, in many different countries, this is the situation that localities access, for example, additional subsidies on a national or federal level, thanks to some national or federal program that includes FFPT. So they apply for some additional funding, and FFPT is part of the climate policy or public transport renewal policy that allows them to tap into additional resources, which paradoxically actually increases the revenue, even though they stop charging for tickets. This is the case of Orbaniu, which so the column on the right, which is a small locality near Marseille in southern France, that completely renewed its public transport system and added a new mode of transport, the tram, which I've been told it's also something that Birmingham or West Midlands is considering. And in the French context, that allowed this city to increase taxes levied on businesses, which combined with free public transport, that was an essential part of the strategy, allowed the city to increase the revenue. And if you see 2 rows up from that additional revenue of 5.7 million euro, that largely covered the costs related to higher demand and revenue lost from fares, so the first 2 rows of the table. In Tallinn, that's a bit of a different situation. I'm not sure we will be able to discuss this in detail, but Tallinn basically provides FFPT only for its residents, tax-paying residents, and announcing this policy allowed to gain a significant number of new taxpayers who registered in the city, and that basically allows the city to gather and to collect higher revenue from these taxpayers, from the income tax, which again largely covers the cost of abolishing fares, so the revenue that otherwise would be collected from fares. So it's not always that you lose money when abolishing fares. So in specific legal administrative context, this actually can lead to significantly higher revenue. Another important set of questions relates to the modal shift. So, I mean, you could argue that one of the purposes, although definitely not the only purpose of public transport provision, is to attract people from other modes, specifically or in particular from private modes of transport, from cars that have, and I'm sure that you know more about it than I do, very detrimental impact on the environment, on urban space and society and all that. So here we can, of course, many questions have been raised about that. We don't have any conclusive evidence, so this is something that I hope to do in future, and this is not something that has been done coherently in a robust way across these 90 plus or 100 plus cities. But we have evidence from Tallinn, for example. That's this graph at the bottom of the slide. So comparison of modal share, so division, so proportion of usage from public different transport modes, for before and after the implementation of FFPT. And we see in blue that public transport share has increased by roughly 8% from 55 to 63, whereas that of the car decreased by 3%, that's in red, and walking decreased by 5%. The conclusion could be that in this particular case, there indeed has been a slight shift of from public transport to the car, but this shift was much stronger. If we can talk about a strong shift in this case, from walking to public transport rather than from the car. So you could argue, and I think this argument would hold probably, that, well, public transport is attractive, but it's attractive mostly to people who would walk in a particular situation. So instead of walking, they would take public transport, which is now free, rather than to car drivers that, well, probably need more incentives or more obstacles to using the car in order to stop using the car. And this is sadly where a lot of the analysis or a lot of the debate about FFPT, public debate, scholarly debate, ends. So you can look at this graph and some similar data from other cities and say, well, it's not doing much in terms of environmental policy or climate change. It's not doing much in terms of modal shift. So, well, as you know, I showed you at the very beginning, it's a policy that doesn't make sense. Well, that would be sad. Sorry, is there somebody? Bob, are you saying something?
No. Another 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, I'll do my best. So here's to show you that, well, free public transport does not involve, old rickety vehicles and all that. Actually, it's another critique that's raised by people who focus very much on the question of modal shift. You can see that the abolition of fares in many localities, here we see Tallinn and Devine, actually can increase the public attention and give public transport a very important place in the public debate, which definitely translates to a stronger political will for continuous renewal of stock in this case. So we see very new trams and buses circulating in these cities. So making something free doesn't make it bad quality. I would say these things are definitely not in contradiction. Well, but looking just at these questions would not be enough, and I think there is a lot of critical questions raised by activists and critical scholars related to the social impact, the urban impact, one could say, of that particular policy. So whether this is something that addresses inequalities, addresses neoliberal capitalist paradigm in terms of transport planning and transport provision, and the last two bullet points, that's maybe something interesting for your group, whether this is something that could be part of an ongoing socio-ecological transition, a positive example of a climate justice policy, not just something that we offer to limit behavior or limit some activities that people are engaging in, but something that we actually want people to enjoy, to offer in place of, for example, individual car-based mobility. And plenty of movements are arguing for that. So what can we focus on in the remaining 5 minutes? I think one very important question is that of who actually benefits from that policy. And we see, it's maybe not overwhelming evidence, but we see quite strong evidence from a few, at least, localities that have done research on that and have done FFPT, is that the usage of public transport as a result of fare abolition increases significantly among diverse underprivileged groups. So basically people who are either young or old, people who are poor or very poor, people who are unemployed, who are studying, studying in this particular case, not really, but people who are unemployed, who are pensioners, use public transport much more than before. which means that, well, if from the environmental point of view, this policy might be not doing miracles, it seems to be doing quite a lot from the social point of view. So it's really giving people access to public transport much more than before. And by extension, of course, access to public transport means access to the particular territory and all the functions and social connections that this offers. However, that does not mean that passengers are by default, empowered. And there is cases such as Oban in which the planning of that policy, the way that this is announced and implemented, it's by no means participative and democratic and transparent. So basically it's a policy that, arrives from the top to the bottom with drivers, controllers and passengers being basically told about this policy rather than being on board. So this is not something that is there by default. I have 2 more slides, maybe 3. And I wrap it up. Another important point to, show some positive sides of the policy. Whoa, where is that going? So from the same locality, Aubagne in France, while I mentioned participation was definitely not a very strong aspect of how the policy was implemented, how fares were abolished. At the same time, what was very clear, and this is something that we can see also in a number of other French localities, is that the idea of the policy was to provide, and that's a quote from one of the interviews I did there with some local associations, to provide some kind of a glue that keeps the society together. And you can imagine how important that is in the context of having Marseille around the corner with its famous high-rise neighborhoods with social exclusion, vandalism, insecurity, state violence and police violence and all that. So on the other hand, just across the border of Marseille, you've got a municipality or set of municipalities that provides free access for whoever wants to use it to public transport that can drive you across the whole territory to meet people, to access culture, education, and all that. So it's a very important social policy over there. And perhaps the last point, for every positive side, there is one negative side, I suppose. And that's a point from Żory, that's a municipality from southern part of Poland. The fact that in some localities is a social policy and to some extent environmental policy does not mean that free public transport cannot be implemented in a very neoliberal, in a very kind of market-driven way. And we have a case there from Poland, and I think that there's a few more cases like that in that country, where basically fair free public transport was an excuse for a local community, for a local authority to privatize the network, to basically leave some kind of publicly run intermunicipal network to establish a completely new one by a company that is not exactly known for its quality and for any experience with public transport provision for that matter, simply because it was cheaper to leave the public sector, to rely less on it and work with a private company. So it can very well be a policy that actually favors or goes hand in hand with privatization. There was quite a few conclusions, but I guess the most important one is also something that I started with, and that's my last slide, is that I don't know how much of this has stayed with you. I'll leave you with the slides, of course, and I'll answer your questions. But the most important point, I think, is that it seems to be a very simple idea. Let's abolish fares, let's provide people with unconditional access to public transport. But the way that this is applied, it's really not uniform across localities. In fact, it can be extremely different. It can be a very right-wing or a very left-wing, or a very environmental or rather neoliberal policy. So it's very important to have clarity in mind in terms of why this can be done or should be done in your particular locality, and for whom this policy is implemented. I think these are key questions when looking at FFPT. Sorry for rushing this a little bit. I probably brought a little bit too much information for that short presentation, but then again, let's have a little discussion. I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much. If you want to stay in touch, here's my email and my website. So I'm curious to hear what you have in mind, and hope I can answer at least some of your questions.